Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
All right, so I want to highlight a specific attack in our show today. Adam and I talked about how to defend external ID or B2C probably a while back now, but there was a specific attack in that we did talk about just briefly, but we're going to really do a whole show on it today. So I want to give you a little bit of a story because this is what happened to me, and then also Adam was a part of it as well just recently. So it was a Thursday afternoon, and my Azure SSP or specialist and the security specialist were reviewing a customer bill. They were reviewing the last monthly charges of this bill, which is something that they typically do to just kind of look at if there were increases, decreases. And what they saw was a significant spike in external ID charges. Normally, the external ID charges were like anywhere between $100 to $200, and this month had spiked to about $40,000. So that's a pretty significant increase. And this was a small organization. Just to give you an idea, the organization was mainly roughly about 7,000 users. So $40,000 on their Azure spend was a significant increase. And, I talked to, the specialist messaged the whole group and said, hey, does anyone know why external ID charges would surge like this? And there's a couple of things, and I was thinking through it, and maybe it was a misconfiguration, or maybe they just deployed a new app that had a bunch of people sign into it. And so, as I was thinking this over, I messaged Adam on a Friday before the call, and I said, we're going to hop on this customer call to kind of talk to them about this charge. And we were just doing the calculations because external ID, I mentioned that they had $40,000. And I think your words initially were, wow, that's a lot. Because external ID, it's a B2C, tenant, essentially. Like if you're not familiar with what a B2C tenant, think like, when you sign up for an account with your bank, or think about when you sign up for an account with like Culver's or McDonald's or something like that, right? Like there's a tenant that's being hosted for customers with an app, usually with an app, a web app or whatever. And that has identities of customers and not your internal directory. They're logically separated. And so there are charges to host identities for that tenant. And so from a licensing perspective, the way that Microsoft Entra works is that we have a 50,000 monthly active user essentially that's baked into, I think it's just Entra in general, right? Is it Entra P1 that you get that?
So that's technically part of the external ID offering in general. So whether they're consumer identities or business-to-business identities, your first 50,000 monthly active users are included at no additional cost.
Yep. So if you, and I think we looked at the charges for additional users, and I think it was like 3 cents a user. So if you take $40,000 and divide it by 3 cents, I think I did the math when I was talking to the customer. It was well over $1 million. It's like $1 million, like 1.4 million additional users on top of the 50,000, which means that you have not only like your 50,000 people that are signing in, but 1.4. And I think like there are a few companies out there that have 1.4 million some users, like Walmart is probably one of them, or Amazon, McDonald's. They probably have millions of customer user accounts in their B2C tenant, but this was a 7,000 seat company that would not have that many. So we were kind of spitballing, and Adam was like, hey, you remember this thing that we talked about on the show? Maybe it's this. And so what we thought was it could be an international revenue share fraud attack. And you might be thinking like, what is that? So let's talk about this. An international revenue share fraud is actually a very easy attack against B2C tenants and people who are hosting this. It's a financial scam where essentially the bad actors are exploiting telecommunication systems to generate large volumes of international calls or SMS traffic towards a premium rate number. And what it does is the premium numbers are usually targeted to carriers that are overseas or shell entities that are owned by the fraudsters. And so the victim systems will pay the inflated fees for these communications, and then the profits are shared between the attackers and the overseas telecom partners. And so that's kind of the nutshell of it. And how it works is the attackers generally will look for a vulnerable entry point into the company's communication or identity infrastructure. And some of those methods might include like hacking poorly configured or legacy private branch exchange or PBX or voice over IP systems. They might exploit open call forwarding options to redirect legitimate calls to premium numbers, or they might target publicly accessible authentication endpoints and then abuse that SMS verification that's used for multi-factor. Once that access is gained, the fraudsters will then use automated bots and scripts to massively inflate traffic. So you'll see a large number of calls or high volumes of SMS one-time passcodes generated to premium international numbers. And the victims organization is billed for those massive volumes of traffic, and then the attackers will take a cut of that revenue generated by the receiving carrier. So in this case, the victim or my customer would pay Microsoft for that bill, and then Microsoft would then pay the carriers that they're using to generate these SMS codes or calls. And what's interesting is when I was talking to Adam on, like what could have generated this, he said, hey, there's actually different rates of SMS. And we didn't know this until we like looked at it.
Yeah, we started looking into it and discovered some of this.
Yeah. And so when you get an SMS text for an MFA, so like if I'm, let's say I'm a McDonald's customer and I'm authenticating to the app and it says, hey, I need to send you a one-time passcode.
And we don't even know, and by the way, if McDonald's is Microsoft customer, it's just a theoretical example, right?
I'm just
you're
using
just pulling one out.
Well, it could be Walmart, it could be any company that you're getting an SMS text code, right?
Yeah,
and
you're signing into some sort of app to order some food.
Yeah, and you get an SMS text and you enter that in. That SMS gets charged regardless. I didn't know this, but Microsoft, and maybe this is different for like Okta or whatever, but for Microsoft, immediately every single SMS text that is in an Entra B2C or external ID tenant gets charged to the customer who is hosting that application.
Mm-hmm.
And there are different rates for those SMS texts depending on where the country of the receiving person is or wherever that telecom network is going to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll put it in the show notes, but obviously if it's in the United States, you're going to pay a very low cost for it. It's 3 cents per text. And this is regardless of that like active user. You just, as soon as you get a text from multi-factor, that gets charged. And so it's 3 cents for a US number. But then like if you're looking at other countries, there's like a low mid tier, there's a mid high tier, and then there's a high tier for high cost countries. And if you look at the high cost countries, it's pretty much what you would expect, like Afghanistan, Iran, like countries that you probably wouldn't be doing a ton of business with as a US customer, or even like, I would say even a European customer maybe.
But also probably they have nationalized telecom. They don't have telecom competition. Also, to your point, do not do the volume other countries do. Maybe have a hostile environment. Relationship with the West, those sorts of things. There's some commonalities between most of them, right? Typically, nationalized telecom is the big one, where it's government-owned telecommunications.
Yeah, and like even the mid-high cost ones surprised me. Like Germany is on the mid-high cost tier. I think Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory, is also in the mid-high cost tier. So the mid-high cost tier could also get kind of lucrative depending on how many customers that you have there.
Yeah, that did surprise me to see some of those. And I think those are examples where it was like formerly nationalized telecom, like in Germany, now it's Deutsche Telekom, but the parent company of T-Mobile, by the way, but that was nationalized telecom for a long time there. And then you also in the EU have a high regulatory burden, and that drives costs higher and all that. So, you can usually point to some factors on why it's high. It's not completely puzzling, but Sometimes it's unusual. But yeah, it's an interesting listing. You do have to check it because it's not just what you think. It's not, well, all Western democracies are the low tier. Not necessarily the case.
Right. And so for the US numbers, it's 3 cents, but at the high cost tier, it's 35 cents a tech. So every single
5 cents. It's 10, more than 10x.
yeah. So it's, if you start getting a lot of these, which, if you use a bot to automate, it can be generate a lot of cost pretty quickly. And so I did the math again. If you take $40,000 and divide it by 35 cents, that's over about 100,000 some 100. I think it was like 114,000 some texts. So if you got 114,000 in a month, which might not be like that ludicrous, but with a bot, it's easily generated. And so we were thinking that this might be the concern. And so this is something that all organizations, if you're hosting some sort of application, this kind of revenue leakage can be pretty staggering. And because it's automated, they can just generate thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars just within a few hours, a few days. And so when we talked to this customer, we said, hey, we're looking at your bill. And they didn't even know, because and I'll get into this later on, but we were initially talking to them, the internal identity team. And we said, hey, you have this bill that has external ID charges that is really high. And like one of the guys was like, yeah, I think I heard someone say something like that. And then they're like, we don't really handle anything on the B2C tenant. That's our developers, right? The development team. And so we have to bring in the right people. And I'm like, well, I think it's this attack. And then we said, well, let's just look at your bill for this month. And we just happened to look at their bill and the day before, so this was for January, and then in February, like the first couple of days, the bill was 5,000 for the day before and 5,000 for the day of that I was talking to the customer. So they had already generated in the first couple of days of February $10,000 of external ID charges. And remember, their normal bill is like $100 to $200. So I said, not only do I think that you were under attack, I think you are currently still under attack right now. And so, we'll get into some of the things on how to mitigate this, but because, there is a lag in the billing and there are like bulk charges that get entered in. If you don't have any like billing alerts set up or any type of, some sort of monitoring for this, these can get really out of hand really quickly without like the teams understanding what's actually going on.
Which, by the way, those are all built in to the Azure billing capabilities. I can't speak to other hyperscalers, but do know in Azure there's a ton of capabilities around notify me about anything anomalous from a billing perspective. You do need to opt in. You do need to turn those on, but they're a great detector of compromise. In particular, they could be misconfiguration as well. Don't get me wrong. It could be internal mistake or error, but certainly attackers like to do things like this or stand up VMs and start crunching crypto, mining Bitcoin, that sort of thing. And you'll hit those very quickly if you have appropriate monitoring in place. So that's something you as a cybersecurity team should take a vested interest in, making sure your monitoring from a billing perspective and your alerting is very tight, because that could be one of your first, hopefully not your first, but maybe your last line of defense to get notified when you have some sort of compromise. Is a lot of it threats and attacks today involve standing stuff up in hyperscale cloud infrastructure and using it to make money through other means, like this example right here, Exhibit A.
Yeah. And so, one of the things that I talked to them initially about was, let's get visibility, because again, when I hopped onto the call, they said, we don't have any insight into the developers and the B2C. But I argue that, I told them, you do need to have insight into that. Like you need to have visibility into what they're doing and then also give them guidance, because a lot of times developers think of usability. They think of, how, if does the code work, not necessarily is the code safe, is the environment safe. Unless you have specific AppSec engineers or developers who are security minded, they won't necessarily think about those certain things. And so, make sure that you have visibility and knowledge into any type of external application development. You should have some sort of AppSec program where you're at least running code through, or even, at a previous company, we were using a third party to do that, we had Bug Crowd, which is a crowdsource type of environment where you can give access to people and have them run through your code and your app and poke for it for holes in it. And we ran stuff through like Veracode, which was very simple, like it's just code scanning, and it comes up with output, and then you can go to your developers and say this library is no good, or you have some, with the fuzzing it has some sort of cross-site scripting or whatever it is, and say, hey, you got to fix this, right? Like you don't need to be a code expert, but you got to have some sort of insight into what they're doing. If they're developing external applications, that could have implications on your app and your company's reputation if something happens to it. Like I said from the beginning, B2C tenants are logically separated, so you can't just like pivot really easily into your company identity store or directory, but you could have a breach within your B2C tenant and those still have administrators. So I think at a minimum, someone within internal security should have admin rights to every single B2C tenant that you're hosting an application in, just so you have insight and kind of can review the configurations and make sure that they're standard and up to your security standards. Also, you want to secure any type of voice systems. If you have voice systems, make sure that they have strict access controls. You can disable international call and call forwarding rules unless you need that for explicit business purposes. You can also geofence outbound traffic to pre-approved low risk regions. One of the things that I was talking to them about was how they did this, because they said in their sign up for an account, they don't even have an area to put international numbers because this was a completely US based organization. So in their app, in their web app, they didn't even have a place to do it, but they were sending, as a result, when we actually looked at the external ID charges, it was SMS text to high cost countries. So they were in fact under this attack. And so, you know, even within the GUI of the web app, you can still run a script and somehow redirect that SMS traffic to whatever, endpoint network that you want. So that doesn't stop them even if there isn't a place to put an international country code. So a couple of basic things when it comes to protecting for this. Number one, you should have some sort of WAF in front of your application. If you have an external application, you should probably have a web application firewall so that you have bot protection to fill out some sort of automated scripts. You can also do a CAPTCHA. So if you require a CAPTCHA for users to sign up, then you can distinguish between human users and automated bots. And also, by default, high risk country codes now, and this is in preview, but high country codes are disabled by default. So you should go and check that and make sure, because obviously if they compromise the environment, they can probably go and turn it back on. But it does by default require administrators to explicitly opt into telephony traffic to these high cost countries. And that's through Entra. So if you're using an Entra tenant for your B2C, your external ID, all high cost country codes for SMS are turned off by default. And there is like a specific workflow to allow a country into that. And so based on all of these things, these are what I suggested to the customer. And we checked back with them over the weekend. So this was on a Friday afternoon. We got on the call with the customer, told them, these are the things that I recommend as a part of our security. And then over the weekend, they did some work. We talked to them on Monday. And then we reviewed the charges, and the charges had basically fell to zero. And so just these basic things, WAF. So they implemented an Azure WAF in front of their application. They did a CAPTCHA, and then they double checked the settings for the high country codes, made sure that they were disabled, and the traffic fell to zero. So that to me, it's like, opportunity. If an attacker finds an app and they have the opportunity to do this, they're going to do it, right? It's pretty low hanging fruit. They run a script and then they generate tens of thousands of dollars within a couple of days. We talked about monitoring as well, right? The billing charges. So just make sure that you're monitoring for any type of anomalies. I don't know if you can scope billing alerts into like a SIM, because it's more maybe like, like a third party SIM, like Splunk might have the ability to do that. But you can at least get like a Teams message. You can automate it with a Power App, get a Teams message or like an email for sure for the alerts to make sure that if anything is out of the ordinary, you get notified. But yeah, this was a super interesting attack that I had never seen this in the wild. I'd never even heard of it. When I briefed my own team on it, they were learning as well. And so this was just a bullet point in our external ID show where we talked about securing external ID. And then it was just crazy that I actually saw one and we were able to alert the customer that they were actually under attack with this. And then, we helped mitigate it.
We don't get to do as much of the investigative part of the job anymore in our current roles, Andy. And so it was kind of fun because we were doing our own little investigation when you brought it to me and said, "Hey, what would be driving so much cost in external ID?" And we did the math and we're like, well, the monthly active users, once you get over 50,000, it's a fraction of a cent. And it's only, again, once per month. Like once that user's taken an activity, they're active for that month. You can't run up more money just by having them engage in more activities, with the sole exception being SMS messages, which, by the way, we didn't touch on in this show much at all, but obviously we encourage you not to use at all for your corporate users. And I get for your external customers and your business to business relationships, maybe you're slightly less concerned about security, but overall, we should just not use this stuff at all, right? And we can help drive our users to other more reliable methods. And so that should be part of our architecture and configuration of our external identity solutions moving forward as well, is reducing the reliance on SMS because if nothing else, it's expensive. Even the 3 cents per hit is still a lot just to do business with your customers. And there's better ways to do that. So certainly be conscientious about that as well. Reduce your reliance on SMS. It basically needs to go away from a authentication perspective anyhow. So this could be a motivator to do that. But it was interesting too, Andy. You mentioned when they had implemented some of these controls, the cost drove down to zero. So they were not under active compromise. It was just kind of a bunch of a confluence of factors, if you will, where many things were either set suboptimally, there wasn't enough monitoring in place. They had like the high cost countries were enabled, which is disabled by default. So someone had turned that on. A whole bunch of poor decisions kind of came together to open the door for this fraud to happen. Keep in mind, if you were under active compromise, none of this stuff matters. Like the attacker could bypass all of this. So this only applies when someone is doing it without having internal access to your environment. Because of course they could turn on high cost countries, they could disable some of the monitoring, they could try to fly under the radar and potentially successfully do it, by the way. So those are all things to be aware of as well. But yeah, really, really interesting. It was, I don't want to say fun because obviously this was fraud and the attackers kind of got away with it here for a while. But it was interesting to do that investigation and find the root cause and then learn more about this attack. And we said at the time, like, we need to share this with our listeners and viewers on the show. When we see something in the real world, that's, I think, one of the favorite things about our job is we get to take what we see across a broad set of customers and kind of apply those learnings and bring that to our audience. Hey, we're seeing a lot of this, we're seeing a lot of that. And so I'm not saying we're seeing a lot of this, but this is potentially something you're at risk of too. So if you can implement some of the controls Andy was talking about, you can really reduce your risk to this. Because again, it was kind of that perfect set of factors where all of the right settings were in place and all of the monitoring was not in place to enable this to happen. So you can protect your environment from this too and prevent these fraudsters from making money off of you and your back moving forward. So definitely an interesting attack I had not heard a lot about other than when we mentioned it in passing, but that was just enough in my head to go, wait a minute, there is a fraud. Hold on. And we peeled it back and we found it. And we were like, yeah, I remember talking about that. So that was, part of the things you can do as you exist in this business and you learn new things is you may not be able to apply it right away. But if it sits in your mind, it can give you that context you need when you're doing your next investigation as well.
Yeah. And, go back and review the external ID security operations show that Adam and I did a few months back. I'll put the documentation that we have for Microsoft in the show notes, specifically on what you need to do for security for external operations. And again, it does touch on this specific attack, but we wanted to highlight this attack for the whole show because it was just very unique. Like I had never seen it. really just barely heard about it. And so I don't think it's something that a lot of security practitioners are aware of. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you learned something. Our contact information, along with the links to the show notes that we used, will be in the show notes. And thanks for watching. Thanks for listening as always. And we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.